shortage in medical supplies. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is meeting with key donors to UNRWA, that's the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, after the U.S. and a dozen other countries halted funding for the agency after Israel accused 12 UNRWA employees of helping Hamas stage the October 7th attack. UNRWA has 13,000 employees. A group of at least 28 organizations, including ActionAid, Oxfam, and Save the Children, issued a statement condemning the decision to suspend funding, warning it could lead to a complete collapse of the humanitarian response in Gaza. UNRWA has fired 9 staffers in response to the allegations. Apparently, one other is dead as the matter is being investigated. On Monday, the UN said Israeli authorities have not directly shared any evidence to substantiate their claims.
You know, we've seen this reference to a dossier. We saw it in the Times, in the Wall Street Journal, in CBS. I'm not going to name all the media organizations, but we respect them all. That information has not been given to us officially by the Israeli authorities.
UNRWA reported today Israel's attacked its facilities in Gaza at least 260 times, killing at least 360 Palestinians since October 7th. The Pentagon on Monday identified the 3 U.S. soldiers killed in a drone attack at a base in Jordan over the weekend. Sergeant William Rivers, Specialist Kennedy Sanders, and Specialist Brianna Moffett were all reservists from Georgia, all 3 of them African American. Meanwhile, early reports say the drone was able to bypass U.S. air defenses because troops had mistaken it for a U.S. drone returning to the base. A group called the Islamic Resistance in Iraq has claimed responsibility for the attack. Iran denies any involvement. President Biden has vowed to retaliate. While the White House has said it's not seeking war with Iran, Republican lawmakers are urging the president to bomb Iran directly. Over a dozen Palestinian Muslim students at Harvard filed a federal civil rights complaint with the Department of Education, accusing Harvard of discrimination and failing to protect them from racism and harassment. The students, who are represented by the Muslim Legal Fund of America, say they've been repeatedly targeted for attacks, including doxing, stalking, and physical assaults, in some cases simply for wearing a Palestinian keffiyeh on campus. This comes as the City Council of Cambridge, which is home to Harvard, passed a resolution Monday calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the release of remaining hostages. In related news, the University of Michigan Faculty Senate Assembly passed a resolution to demand the school divest from any company profiting from Israel's war on Gaza. In Pakistan, a court has sentenced former Prime Minister Imran Khan to 10 years in prison, accusing him of leaking state secrets. Khan has rejected the charges against him as politically motivated. He's already serving a 3-year prison sentence on corruption charges. Shah Mahmood Qureshi, former foreign minister, top official in Imran Khan's PTI party, has also been sentenced to 10 years. This all comes 1 week ahead of February 8th elections, which Khan has been barred from. Khan was ousted as prime minister in 2022, blaming the military and rival parties for plotting against him. In other news from Pakistan, the Iranian foreign minister traveled to Islamabad Monday as the 2 countries moved to de-escalate tensions following deadly airstrikes within each other's borders earlier this month. This is the Iranian foreign minister, Hossein Amir Abdullahian.
If you look at the history of Iran and Pakistan, you will see that there have never been any case of the territorial differences or border problems and issues between Iran and Pakistan. So this is one of our prides, and this is one of our very clear manifestations of our good bilateral relations.
In Sudan, at least 54 people were killed, including children, and 2 UN peacekeepers in attacks along the border with South Sudan. This weekend's clashes in the oil-rich territory of Abyei, which is claimed by both Sudan and South Sudan, is the deadliest since at least 2021. Meanwhile, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court said there's evidence both the Sudanese army and the RSF are committing war crimes in Darfur. This is ICC prosecutor Karim Khan.
I'm compelled to conclude and to report that it's my assessment that we are fast approaching a breaking point and that the conflict in Sudan demands your attention now more than ever.
Nearly half of Sudan's 49 million residents are in urgent need of aid, with about 8 million people displaced by the intensifying violence. The UN estimates some 12,000 people have been killed, but the true death toll is believed to be much higher.
This is his
The
doing.
United States has reinstated economic sanctions on Venezuela following a decision by the Venezuelan Supreme Court to uphold a ban of leading opposition presidential candidate Maria Corina Machado from running. Elections are scheduled for later this year. The government of President Nicolas Maduro accuses Machado of supporting the harsh U.S. sanctions that have tanked the Venezuelan economy and of backing a U.S.-imposed unelected interim opposition government. Machado, who won a primary election held by the opposition last October, spoke yesterday.
I received the command of almost 3 million Venezuelans who exercised popular sovereignty on October 22nd, the opposition primary election day. I represent that popular sovereignty. They cannot have elections without me, nor the millions of Venezuelans who voted on that day.
The White House has given Maduro's government until April to allow Machado on the ballot. Last October, the U.S. eased some sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry under the condition Maduro allowed opposition candidates to participate in the election. Those sanctions could also be rolled back if the ban on Machado is kept in place. Tension continues to mount on Capitol Hill as the Senate pushes negotiations for a bipartisan border enforcement deal attached to military aid for Ukraine. Far-right Republicans, encouraged by former President Trump, have said they'll sabotage the deal, even though it includes some of the harshest immigration restrictions yet, including granting executive authority to block people from applying for asylum once the number of apprehended migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border reaches a daily average of 5,000 in a week. President Biden's already vowed to use the new emergency authorities to shut down the southern border, praising the deal as, quote, the toughest and fairest set of reforms to secure the border we've ever had in our country.
He's only doing it because he wants to win the
Immigration rights groups
election.
have condemned the deal,
He's only
urging
doing it because he want to win the
Biden to support
election.
humanitarian relief.
doesn't
The
care
proposal also drew
because he
criticism
opened the
from
border
Mexican
to
President
begin
Andrés
with.
Manuel López Obrador.
Pues eso no es serio.
Well, that's not realistic. With all due respect, how are we going to solve the migration problems with walls? How are we going to solve migration problems by closing the border? Why these proposals? Because elections are coming.
Boom.
And here in New York, Harlem Council member and exonerated Central Park 5 member Yusuf Salam was pulled over by police Friday night while driving with his family, his wife and 4 daughters. Dashcam video shows the officer appearing to back off after Salam, who was sworn in less than a month ago, identifies himself as a member of the New York City Council. Salam says the officer never responded to his request to know why he was being stopped. The NYPD later said it's because his car windows were illegally tinted and he had an out-of-state license plate. The incident comes as the New York City Council appears poised to override Mayor Eric Adams' veto on a police accountability bill and legislation that bans solitary confinement in prisons. Intro 586, known as the How Many Stops Act, would mandate officers record demographic information and give a reason for stopping people. Last week, council members, including Yusuf Salam, faith leaders, and community organizers gathered in support of the act. This is activist Crystal Walford.
This Intro 586 is not going to stop everything in this moment, but it will give us the data, the information. It will call on our NYPD to act differently. In the 10 years that Faith in New York has been in existence, we have stood on those city hall steps too many times for people who have been murdered by police. One too many times.
But we
have
need
stood
an
on these city hall
investigation.
steps too many times,
We need an
demanding that the
investigation.
NYPD be transparent.
Yes, we need an
have stood on these
investigation.
steps
That I
too
agree
many
with.
times,
We got to be
asking and
transparent.
demanding accountability.
And
Asking
accountability.
and demanding that our NYPD stop killing our people.
And those are some of the headlines.
But our people got to stop
This
provoking
is
it
Democracy
as well.
Now!, democracynow.org, The
Provoking
War and
it
Peace
as
Report.
well.
I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in Chicago. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
We begin today's show with news that Ohio lawmakers are taking the, quote, next steps to kickstart their execution chamber with experimental nitrogen gas. Just days after, Alabama used the same method for the first time in U.S. history, gassing a prisoner to death. The UN has warned this is a form of torture. Ohio's Republican Governor Mike DeWine had said lethal injection was no longer an option for executions after a federal judge ruled it could cause severe pain and needless suffering. But Ohio's Republican State Attorney General, Dave Yost, wrote on X, quote, "Perhaps nitrogen, widely available and easy to manufacture, can break the impasse." Yost and other officials are holding a news conference today less than a week after Alabama executed 58-year-old Kenneth Smith with the nitrogen gas asphyxiation last Thursday. This is a media witness to the execution, Ivana Hryynko, a journalist with AL.com.
Kenneth Smith made a lengthy final statement. It began with, Tonight, Alabama caused humanity to take a step backward. Kenneth Smith also made a I love you sign in sign language with one of his hands that was facing the room where his family was witnessing, along with media witnesses. He appeared conscious for several minutes into the execution. For about 2 minutes following that, Kenneth Smith shook and writhed for about 2 minutes on a gurney. That was followed by several minutes of deep breaths on the gurney. Following that, his breath slowed until it was no longer perceptible for media witnesses. The governor's office pronounced the time of death at 8:25. And again, the curtains closed to that room at 8:15 p.m.
The day after Alabama executed Smith, Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall encouraged other states to use nitrogen hypoxia.
To my colleagues across the country, many of which were watching last night, Alabama has done it, and now so can you. And we stand ready to assist you in implementing this method in your states.
Alabama officials claim the nitrogen gas execution is humane and effective. But for more, we're joined by Kenneth Eugene Smith's spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, who says it was the most horrible thing I've ever seen. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Jeff. So you were there watching Smith die, watching him gassed to death. Describe what you saw. And we realize this is not easy. You are just coming off of this execution.
Good morning, Amy. Thank you so much. Like I said, it was the most horrific thing I've ever seen. I mean, the gas mask fits from the top of the head to under the chin. It's looks like a firefighter's mask. Once the execution began, it was very clear that Kenny was suffering immensely. He begins to pump back and forth. It really looked like a fish out of water, a fish on a dock. As he pumps back and forth, the gurney was shaking. Very clear he was resisting or pushing against the restraints. Every time he pushed forward, his face would thrust into the mask. The mask was tied to the gurney by two, short, small pieces of material.
Brutal.
So every time he came forward, his face would slam into the front of the mask. And there was spit, mucus, all sorts of fluids coming out of his mouth, and it was hitting the front of the mask. And so what that looked like was, mucus, and these fluids were streaming down the mask. He was very clearly in unbelievable duress. His face was turning purple and red. His eyeballs looked like they were about to pop out. It was horrible. It was absolutely horrible, and it was shocking that this is taking place in a nation that prides itself on being one of the human rights leaders of the world.
That's right.
And Reverend Hood, I wanted to ask you, this is the fifth execution you've seen now in 13 months. Why do you witness these? And what about this argument that officials are constantly claiming that there's a humane way to execute people?
I mean, for me, there's two reasons. One is to provide witness, like I'm doing right now, to the horror that these executions are. Two is, of course, to provide spiritual comfort to the guys that I work with. I believe that the message of Jesus is very clear, that we are to love the least of these, those who society has shunned, the marginalized and the oppressed. With regards to the humaneness of this, anyone who would say that is either a lunatic or a liar. This idea that what we saw last week was textbook or that it was normal or anything like that is absolutely absurd. There is no humane way to kill people. There is only ways to kill people. There's only ways to perpetuate evil. It's hard to believe that as a modern society that we are still so addicted to killing each other.
Notice
and of course, as we kill each other, we teach our young people to continue killing as a form of vengeance and as a perpetuation of violence.
Like in the black neighborhood.
Reverend Hood, this was the
Talking about
second.
a rapper.
Well,
And he rapping
there was
about
a
fucking killing all the fucking
attempt
time.
at an execution.
What the hell is that?
Of Mr. Smith.
But you don't
several
say
years
nothing about
ago.
COVID-19
Is that right?
except some
Where
bullshit
it
ass
was
video that you
November
made in
2022.
2013.
The executioners frantically sought in vain to deliver the deadly cocktail, resorting at one point to subjecting Smith strapped to a gurney to an inverted crucifixion position as one person on the team repeatedly and painfully jabbed a needle under his collarbone. Even Alabama's ultra-conservative Republican Governor Kay Ivey said there had to be alternative means of execution. And the reason states are moving towards gassing prisoners to death is European companies that provided the chemical right for an injection have said it can't be used to execute people because it harkens back to the Holocaust.
Right. Well, I can tell you that if these attorney generals around the country saw what I saw on last week, I mean, like I said, I mean, this is absolutely horrendous. It's horrific. I'm thankful that lethal injections have slowed down. I'm thankful for European companies that has pushed back against sending these drugs to the United States. But I will also say that it's very clear that what we are witnessing is, again, a moral apocalypse. We are seeing states trying these different methods that are going to increase the quotient of torture in this country. And again, it's absolutely horrendous.
Well, Reverend Jeff Hood, a spiritual death row advisor, most recently to Kenneth Smith, we thank you for being with us. The previous spiritual advisor who witnessed the first failed execution attempt could never see Mr. Smith again because he was destroyed by what he watched. In an extraordinary development, though, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled last week that Oklahoma death row prisoner Richard Glossip will now get the chance to argue for a new trial after maintaining his innocence for 3 decades. Glossip has faced 9 separate execution dates, been given his final meal 3 times. In 2015, he was saved from death just hours before his execution, only after prison officials admitted they'd ordered the wrong drug. Well, last Monday, Richard Glossip was granted what might be his last lifeline. The U.S. Supreme Court announced it'll hear his appeal, which is also supported by Oklahoma's elected Republican Attorney General Gentner Drummond. On Monday, Democracy Now! Spoke to Sister Helen Prejean, one of the world's most well-known anti-death penalty activists, who's been Glossip's spiritual advisor since 2015. We asked her to respond.
The response of the Supreme Court to grant cert to Richard Glossip was greeted in my heart and by the lawyers and by Richard himself ecstatically. I mean, what a miracle it is coming from 3 really close calls to execution, and then to see the turn of events in this case, where because of his good lawyer, Don Knight, who was in there with Oklahoma legislators, going quail hunting with them and really befriending them, then bringing them to death row to meet Richard Glossop. All these guys are for the death penalty. It's a red state. And they meet Richard and they begin to look at all the questions in his case, and they get in his court. They get on his side and they begin to speak out. Then, unbelievable to me, I had never seen this happen before. The Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma meets Richard, sees the case, and actually filed with the defense attorneys to the Supreme Court saying the state made mistakes in this case and we withdraw the death penalty. So we were waiting and waiting on the court because they've had it several months. What are they going to do if you have the main prosecutor in a state withdrawing the death penalty? The Supreme Court is not a prosecutor. You know, it's an adjudicator, a judge. But it took them a long time to acknowledge it and to grant cert. With the arguments will probably be heard in June. So over 25 years of the new evidence that surfaced of all the state that all they did wrong will finally be heard by the Supreme Court of the United States. And I believe what will happen is they will remand it back for a new trial, which I don't believe any court in Oklahoma is about to do because they did so many underhand things that'll all be exposed, and I think they'll let Richard go free.
Sister Helen Prashon, one of the world's most